Employee discovers undercover owner's wallet and brought him to tears with his request. The fluorescent lights of Joe's Corner Diner flickered against the rain-streaked windows, casting a warm glow onto the wet pavement outside. It was that peculiar hour between midnight and dawn when the world seemed to hold its breath, when the late-night stragglers had gone home, but the early birds hadn't yet stirred from their nests. Inside, the gentle hum of the ancient refrigerator provided a steady backdrop to the soft clinking of dishes as Ethan Matthews wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that night. At 26, Ethan's face carried the weight of someone much older. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, evidence of the double shifts he'd been pulling for months. His mother's medical bills had been piling up faster than autumn leaves, and the insurance company's latest rejection letter sat heavy in his back pocket, creased from being read and reread during his brief breaks. Just one more hour, he whispered to himself, a mantra that had become as familiar as the coffee-stained apron tied around his waist. The diner's night shift wasn't anyone's idea of a dream job, but it paid an extra $50 per hour, and right now, every penny counted. A movement outside caught his eye. Through the rain-blurred glass, he could make out Charlie's hunched figure huddled under the awning of the closed bookstore next door. The old man had become a regular fixture in the neighborhood over the past year, his weathered face and tattered coat as much a part of the street's landscape as the rusty fire hydrant on the corner. Ethan glanced at the clock, 12:47 a.m., then at the plate of untouched meatloaf returned by a picky customer earlier. It would go in the trash anyway. The diner's policy was strict about leftovers. His gaze shifted to the security camera in the corner, its red light blinking like a judgmental eye. But some rules, Ethan had learned, were meant to be bent, if not broken entirely. He waited until Betty, the cook, disappeared into the walk-in freezer before quickly wrapping the meatloaf in foil and tucking it into his apron pocket. The coffee pot was still half full, and would be dumped soon anyway. He filled a paper cup, adding 3 sugars. He noticed that's how Charlie liked it when kind customers occasionally bought him a drink. The bell above the door chimed as Ethan stepped outside, the sudden gust of wind sending a spray of rain into his face. "Hey, Charlie," he called softly, approaching the huddled figure. "Thought you might want something warm." Charlie's face emerged from within his coat collar, his eyes brightening at the sight of the steaming cup. "Ethan, my boy," he said, his voice rough but warm, like worn leather. "You're going to get yourself in trouble one of these days." Ethan smiled, passing over the coffee and carefully concealed meatloaf. "Trouble's relative. Besides, I've seen worse things than sharing food with a friend." Charlie's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the offerings. Whether from cold or emotion, Ethan couldn't tell. "You're a good soul, boy. Reminds me of my own son, God rest him." It was the first personal detail Charlie had ever shared, and it hung in the air between them like the mist that swirled around their feet. "I didn't know you had a son," Ethan said quietly, leaning against the wall beside Charlie, not minding the dampness seeping through his uniform. Charlie took a long sip of coffee before responding. "Michael. Would have been about your age now. Bright kid, heart of gold, just like you. Always looking out for others, even when he barely had enough for himself." He paused, his weathered face tightening. "Lost him in Afghanistan. 7 years ago this month." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd always sensed there was more to Charlie than met the eye, but this glimpse into his past transformed him from a nameless homeless man into someone's father, someone's hero's father. Just then, the diner's door swung open, and Betty's voice called out, "Ethan! Phone call, sounds important." "Coming." Ethan called back, then turned to Charlie. "Stay dry if you can. I'll try to bring you breakfast in the morning." Charlie nodded, clutching the warm cup close to his chest. "You're fighting your own war, aren't you, son? Those hospital bills for your mama?" Ethan froze, surprised. He'd never mentioned his mother's illness to Charlie. "I may be homeless, boy, but I've got eyes. Seen you reading those medical letters on your breaks. Seen the worry eating at you." Charlie's gaze was sharp, belying his disheveled appearance. "Sometimes the biggest heroes aren't the ones in uniform. They're the ones who keep fighting the quiet battles every day. The words followed Ethan back into the diner, where he found Betty holding the phone with an unusually serious expression. "It's the hospital," she said softly. Ethan's heart stuttered as he took the receiver, his mother's latest test results suddenly looming large in his mind. As he listened to the voice on the other end, he didn't notice the elderly man sitting alone in the corner booth, watching the entire scene unfold with keen interest over the rim of his coffee cup. The man's scruffy appearance and worn clothes masked something that would have surprised everyone in the diner, including Ethan, whose act of kindness had just set in motion a chain of events that would change multiple lives forever. The hospital call had been both a blessing and a curse. His mother's condition hadn't worsened, that was the blessing. The curse came in the form of a new experimental treatment the doctors wanted to try, one that insurance definitely wouldn't cover. Ethan's hands shook as he mechanically wiped down tables, his mind spinning with numbers that refused to add up to anything but despair. "Go home, honey," Betty said softly, touching his shoulder. "You look like death warmed over. I'll finish up here." Ethan started to protest, but Betty cut him off with a stern look that reminded him of his mother. "Doctor's orders," she said, then added with a wink. "And I outrank you in diner years." The elderly man in the corner booth had left sometime during Ethan's phone call, leaving behind an empty coffee cup and a generous tip that made Ethan's chest tighten with gratitude. He noticed the man coming in more frequently lately, always alone, always quiet, his appearance gradually becoming more disheveled. Something about him tugged at Ethan's memory, but he couldn't quite place it. As Ethan gathered his things to leave, the flash of something brown caught his eye beneath the elderly man's booth. He bent down to investigate and found a leather wallet, worn smooth with age. The material was expensive, the kind you'd find in high-end stores, not the discount shops where Ethan bought his clothes. "Betty," he called out, "did you see which way the old gentleman went?" "Left about 10 minutes ago," she replied from the kitchen. "Why?" Ethan turned the wallet over in his hands. The right thing would be to open it, find an ID, and return it. But something made him hesitate. The weight of his mother's medical bills pressed against his back pocket, and for one terrible moment, he thought about how many problems this wallet might solve. The thought made him sick to his stomach. With trembling fingers, he opened the wallet. The first thing he saw was cash, more cash than he'd ever seen in one place. $100 bills, crisp and neat, at least 20 of them. Behind them, several platinum credit cards gleamed in the diner's fluorescent lighting. But it was the ID that made his breath catch. The name read, William Foster, and the address listed was for one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. The photo showed a well-groomed, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to their scruffy regular customer, minus about a month's worth of beard and several $1,000s worth of clothing. "That can't be right," Ethan muttered, studying the ID more closely. The eyes were the same, that piercing blue that seemed to look right through you. But everything else about the man in the photo spoke of wealth and privilege, not the humble character who left generous tips with weathered hands. As he continued examining the wallet's contents, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor. Ethan picked it up and found himself staring at a newspaper clipping from 15 years ago. The headline read, "Local business owner loses family in tragic accident." The accompanying photo showed a younger William Foster with his arm around a beautiful woman, while two teenage children smiled broadly at the camera. The caption mentioned that Foster's wife and children had been finished by a drunk driver. Suddenly, the man's solitary nature made more sense. But it didn't explain why someone wealthy enough to live in the city's best neighborhood would spend his nights in a modest diner, dressed like someone who could barely afford a cup of coffee. Ethan's phone buzzed, a text from the hospital. His mother was asking for him. He glanced at the wallet again, thinking about how many months of treatment the cash inside could cover. The thought disappeared as quickly as it came, shame burning in his chest. His mother had taught him better than that. He was about to put the wallet in his backpack when he noticed something else, a small photo tucked behind the credit cards. It showed Charlie, at least 20 years younger, in military dress uniform. On the back was written, To Dad, I'll make you proud. Love, Michael. Ethan's knees went weak, and he had to grab the edge of the booth to steady himself. The pieces started falling into place. Charlie's son Michael, finished in Afghanistan. The same Michael whose father, according to the photo, was William Foster. But that would mean... You okay, Ethan? Betty called from the kitchen. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, he managed to reply, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Just tired. He carefully returned everything to the wallet, his mind racing. If William Foster was Charlie's father, why was one living in luxury while the other slept on the streets? Why would a wealthy man pretend to be a humble diner regular? And most importantly, what was Ethan supposed to do with this information? His phone buzzed again, another message from the hospital. His mother's nurse saying she was having trouble sleeping, asking if he could bring her favorite tea when he visited. Such a small request, yet it meant everything. His mother, who had raised him alone, who had worked 3 jobs to put him through school, who had never once complained about her illness, she deserved every ounce of comfort he could provide. Looking at the wallet in his hands, Ethan made a decision. Tomorrow, he would return it to William Foster. Not because he expected a reward, but because it was the right thing to do. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to help heal the rift between a father and son who had both lost too much. As he stepped out into the night, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glossy under the streetlights. Charlie's usual spot was empty now, but Ethan could still hear his words from earlier. Sometimes the biggest heroes aren't the ones in uniform, they're the ones who keep fighting the quiet battles every day. Ethan tucked the wallet safely into his inner jacket pocket, right next to his heart. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, he had a choice to make and a mother who needed her tea. Morning arrived with the subtle grace of a freight train. Ethan had barely slept, the weight of William Foster's wallet seeming to burn through his jacket where he'd hung it carefully on his bedroom chair. He'd spent hours at the hospital with his mother, watching her sip the chamomile tea he'd brought, her thin fingers wrapped around the paper cup as if it contained liquid gold instead of simple herbs. Something's troubling you, she'd said, her voice weak but her eyes sharp as ever. I can see it in your shoulders. You're carrying them the same way your father used to when he was wrestling with his conscience. Ethan had tried to deflect, but Martha Matthews hadn't raised a fool. Just work stuff, Mom. Nothing for you to worry about. She'd reached out and taken his hand, her skin cool and papery against his. Sometimes the right thing and the easy thing look very different, sweetheart. But I've never known you to choose easy over right. Now, as Ethan pushed open the diner's door for his morning shift, those words echoed in his mind. The morning rush was in full swing, the clatter of plates and murmur of conversations filling the air with familiar comfort. Betty was working the grill, her gray hair escaping from beneath her hairnet as she flipped pancakes with practiced efficiency. You look like you went 10 rounds with your pillow and lost, she commented as Ethan tied on his apron. Coffee's fresh. You better grab some before the vultures descend. Ethan was about to reply when the door chimed. His heart jumped as William Foster walked in, looking more disheveled than ever. The man's clothes were expensive but rumpled, as if he'd slept in them, and his silver hair stuck out at odd angles. Yet there was something dignified in his bearing, something that spoke of boardrooms and business deals rather than greasy spoons and bottomless coffee. Foster took his usual booth, the one where he'd left his wallet the night before. Ethan's hand instinctively went to his own pocket, where the wallet now rested. He'd brought it to return it, but now that the moment had arrived, he found himself hesitating. The usual, sir? Ethan asked, approaching the booth with coffee pot in hand. Foster looked up, and for a moment, Ethan saw past the careful disguise. The man's eyes were red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept either. Please, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of carefully contained emotion. As Ethan poured the coffee, his gaze drifted to the window. Charlie was out there, huddled in his usual spot, clutching a paper cup from the convenience store across the street. Father and son, separated by nothing more than a pane of glass and years of unspoken words. Sir? Ethan began, then stopped. How do you tell someone you know their deepest secret? How do you bridge a gap that's grown so wide? Foster looked up expectantly, those piercing blue eyes, so like Charlie's, searching Ethan's face. I found something last night, Ethan continued, reaching for his pocket. Something I think belongs to you. The moment Ethan placed the wallet on the table, he saw something crack in Foster's carefully maintained facade. The man's hands trembled as he reached for it, his fingers brushing the worn leather as if touching a relic from another life. You found this? Foster's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, sir. Under your booth last night. Ethan paused, gathering his courage. I had to look inside to find out who it belonged to. Foster's eyes snapped up to meet his, sudden fear replacing the gratitude. He knew what Ethan must have seen. The photo, Foster said, his words heavy with unspoken pain. You saw the photo of Michael? Yes, sir. And I know who Charlie is. Ethan glanced out the window again. He talks about Michael sometimes. About losing him in Afghanistan. About how proud he was of his son. Foster's hands clenched around the wallet. You don't understand, he said, but his voice cracked on the words. You're right, I don't, Ethan agreed. I don't understand how a father could let his son live on the streets. Especially after losing. He stopped himself, remembering the newspaper clipping about Foster's wife and other children. After losing everything else? Foster finished bitterly. That's exactly why. I couldn't bear to lose another child. When Michael came back from his first tour, he was different. Angry. Haunted. He started drinking, just like the man who... Foster's voice broke. The man who finished his mother and siblings. I tried to help, tried to get him into programs, but he refused. Said he didn't deserve to be saved when his buddies hadn't made it home. Ethan sank into the booth across from Foster, the morning rush forgotten. Outside, Charlie shifted in his spot, pulling his coat tighter against the morning chill. I thought if I cut him off, he'd hit bottom and come back. Foster continued, his voice hollow. Instead, he disappeared. By the time I found him again, he was living on the streets. I bought this diner because it was close to where he usually stayed. Started coming in disguise, trying to work up the courage to talk to him. But every time I see him, I see my failure as a father. With all due respect, sir, Ethan said quietly, what I see out there is a man who still loves his son enough to check the obituaries every morning, hoping not to find his name. And in here, I see a father who's punishing himself for trying to save his child the only way he knew how. Foster's eyes filled with tears. How do you know about the obituaries? Charlie told me. Said he does the same thing, checking them for news of his father. You're both so afraid of losing each other that you've already lost years you could have had together. A crash from the kitchen broke the moment. Betty was calling for help with a spilled pot of soup. Ethan stood, straightening his apron. The wallet's returned, sir. What you do with the rest of its contents is up to you. He turned to go, then paused. But if you want my advice? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. As Ethan walked away, he couldn't help but notice that William Foster's gaze had shifted to the window, where his son sat unaware of how close his father really was. The wallet lay open on the table between them, Michael's military photo a bridge waiting to be crossed. The rest of Ethan's shift passed in a blur of coffee refills and plate deliveries, but his mind kept returning to the booth where William Foster sat, barely touching his breakfast as he stared out the window at Charlie. The wallet remained on the table, like a bridge either man knew how to cross. Around noon, the hospital called again. This time, the news made Ethan's knees buckle. The new treatment they discussed would cost $75,000, but early trials showed an 80% success rate. The doctor's words echoed in his ears. This could be your mother's best chance, Mr. Matthews. But we'll need a decision, and the first payment, by the end of the week. Ethan steadied himself against the counter, his mind racing. Even if he worked double shifts every day for a year, there was no way he could come up with that kind of money. The diner's regular customers, noticing his distress, gave him concerned looks, but he managed to maintain his professional smile. Years of practice had made it almost convincing. As the lunch rush wound down, William Foster finally stood to leave. Ethan watched as the man carefully tucked the wallet into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate, as if each gesture carried the weight of years of regret. Foster approached the counter, pulling out several $100 bills. "For your honesty," he said quietly, holding out the money to Ethan. "And for..." He glanced toward the window, where Charlie was still visible. "For everything else." Ethan looked at the money, enough to cover at least the first payment for his mother's treatment, and felt his throat tighten. The temptation was overwhelming, but something deeper than need held him back. He thought of Charlie, of the stories he'd shared about his son, of the pride and love that still shone in his eyes when he spoke of Michael. He thought of his own mother, who had taught him that integrity wasn't something you could buy or sell. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Foster," Ethan said softly, pushing the money back across the counter. "But I didn't return your wallet for a reward." Foster's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Then what do you want?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan could feel Betty watching from the kitchen, could sense the few remaining customers trying to pretend they weren't listening. This was the moment that would define not just his character, but perhaps the lives of everyone involved. "If you really want to do something," Ethan said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "help Charlie. Get him a warm place to stay for the winter." He paused, then added, "Better yet, give him back his father." Foster's face went pale, his hands gripping the counter so hard his knuckles turned white. "You don't understand what you're asking," he whispered. "Actually, sir, I do." Ethan leaned forward, speaking low enough that only Foster could hear. "Every morning, I watched my mother fight for her life. The doctors say she needs an expensive treatment we can't afford. I could really use that reward money you're offering. But what Charlie needs, what you both need, is worth more than any amount of cash." Tears welled up in Foster's eyes. "He'll never forgive me," he said, his voice breaking. "I abandoned him when he needed me most." "Maybe," Ethan agreed. "But right now, he's out there counting obituaries, terrified of finding your name. And you're in here doing the same thing. You're both already grieving each other, and you're both still alive. That seems like a waste of precious time to me." Foster turned to look out the window again, and for the first time, Ethan saw something change in his expression. The carefully maintained mask of indifference cracked, revealing the raw pain and hope beneath. "My wife," Foster said suddenly. "Before the accident, she always said I was too proud for my own good. Said I'd rather be right than happy." He pulled out the old photo of Michael in his uniform. "When he came back from Afghanistan, I thought I could fix him like I fixed everything else, with money and tough love. I was so focused on being right, I forgot to just be his father. It's not too late," Ethan said gently. "Charlie told me once that the hardest part of losing his son in Afghanistan was all the things left unsaid. Don't let him lose his father the same way." Foster's hand went to his pocket, where the wallet rested. "The money," he said, "for your mother's treatment. Please take it. Not as a reward, but as a thank you. For showing me what real wealth looks like." But Ethan shook his head. "My mother raised me to believe that doing the right thing isn't a transaction, sir. It's just what you do." He gestured toward the window. "Charlie's probably hungry. The meatloaf special is good today." For a long moment, Foster stood frozen, looking between Ethan and the window where his son sat. Then, slowly, he reached into his wallet and pulled out not the hundreds he'd offered before, but a small, creased photo, the one of his whole family, taken before the accident. "I haven't shown this to anyone in 15 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe it's time to start talking about them again. Maybe it's time to start living again." He squared his shoulders, looking suddenly more like the successful businessman from his ID photo than the disguised diner regular. "Thank you, Ethan, for seeing what I've been blind to for far too long." As Foster turned toward the door, Ethan called after him. Sir? Charlie likes his coffee with 3 sugars. And he's got some pretty amazing stories about his son, if you're willing to listen. Foster paused, his hand on the door handle, and nodded once. Then he stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, leaving Ethan to watch as a father took the first steps toward bridging a gap that had seemed impossibly wide just hours before. Ethan couldn't concentrate for the rest of his shift. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift to the window, where father and son sat together on the bench outside the diner. He couldn't hear their words, but their body language told a story of its own. Charlie sat rigid at first, his weathered hands clenched in his lap, while William Foster spoke, his shoulders hunched with the weight of 15 years of regret. The afternoon crowd began trickling in, but Betty shooed Ethan away from his duties. Some things are more important than coffee refills, she said, her eyes misty as she too watched the scene unfolding outside. In 30 years of serving eggs and coffee, I've never seen anything like this. Time seemed to move differently outside the diner's windows. The sun traced its arc across the sky as father and son remained deep in conversation. Occasionally, one of them would wipe their eyes, or gesture emphatically, or simply sit in heavy silence. Around 4 o'clock, Charlie pulled something from his coat pocket, a worn, folded piece of paper that made William Foster cover his face with his hands. His discharge papers, Betty said softly, having appeared at Ethan's elbow. Charlie showed them to me once. Said they were the only proof he had left that he'd once been somebody's son to be proud of. The dinner rush was beginning when William Foster finally came back inside, alone. Charlie had walked away a few minutes earlier, his steps somehow lighter despite his hunched posture. Foster's eyes were red, his face lined with dried tears, but there was something different about him, as if a great weight had shifted, not disappeared but perhaps become more bearable. He approached the counter where Ethan was totaling receipts, but instead of taking his usual booth, he gestured toward the back office. Could I have a moment of your time, Ethan? Betty raised her eyebrows but said nothing as Ethan followed Foster into the small office. The room was cluttered with invoices and schedules, the ancient desk computer humming tiredly in the corner. Foster closed the door and took a deep breath. Michael, Charlie, agreed to move into a room at the Clayton Hotel, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Just temporarily, until we figure things out. He's stubborn, just like his mother was. Refuses to come home yet, says he needs to earn it. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. But he's willing to try. That's more than I dared hope for this morning. That's wonderful, sir, Ethan said sincerely. The Clayton's a nice place. Warm, clean. Yes, well, Foster cleared his throat. There's something else we need to discuss. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. This is for your mother's treatment. Ethan started to protest, but Foster held up his hand. Please let me finish. This isn't a reward for returning my wallet. This is back pay. Back pay? Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. Sir, I own this diner, Ethan. The words fell into the small office like stones into still water. Have for the past 12 years. I bought it when I first found Michael living on these streets. Thought maybe if I could keep an eye on him. He shook his head. But I was a coward. Couldn't face him directly. So I created this elaborate disguise, came in at odd hours, watched from a distance while pretending to be just another customer. Ethan sank into the creaky office chair, his mind reeling. But Mr. Johnson is my employee, yes. Manages the day-to-day operations. But I'm the owner. Foster ran a hand through his silver hair. I've watched you, Ethan. Watched how you treat people, not just Michael, but everyone. The extra coffee you slip to tired truckers, the way you remember everyone's names and stories, how you work double shifts without complaint to help your mother. He placed the envelope on the desk between them. I've been paying the staff here less than they deserve because I was afraid raising wages would draw attention to the diner, attention that might make it back to Michael. It was selfish and wrong. This envelope contains the difference between what you should have been making and what you were paid, Plus interest for every hour you've worked here. Ethan stared at the envelope, his throat tight. Sir, I can't. You can and you will. Foster's voice was firm but gentle. Because your mother needs it, and because you've earned it. Not just with your work, but with your heart. He paused, then added softly. You helped me find my son again. Let me help you keep your mother. Tears blurred Ethan's vision as he reached for the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, he found a cashier's check for exactly $75,000, the amount his mother's treatment would cost. There's something else, Foster continued, pulling out a second envelope. This is your new contract. I'm promoting you to manager, effective immediately. Double your current salary, full benefits, including family medical coverage. His eyes softened. I need someone who understands that a business is more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. Someone who sees people as people, not problems or profits. Ethan clutched both envelopes, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Say you'll help me turn this place into something more than just a diner, Foster replied. Michael, Charlie, told me about all the people out there like him. Veterans struggling to find their way home, families one paycheck away from disaster, lonely souls needing more than just a meal. He gestured toward the window, where the evening light was painting the street in shades of gold. You've already been creating a community here, one cup of coffee and one act of kindness at a time. I want to make it official. Through the office window, Ethan could see Betty serving customers, her movements efficient and graceful after decades of practice. He thought about all the stories these walls had witnessed, all the lives that intersected over plates of eggs and endless cups of coffee. He thought about Charlie, finally sleeping in a real bed tonight, and William Foster, finally taking steps toward redemption. Yes, he said simply. I'll help you build it. Foster nodded, tears gleaming in his eyes again. Good. Because I have a feeling this is just the beginning of our story. 3 months later, Joe's Corner Diner had become almost unrecognizable, yet somehow more itself than ever before. The worn vinyl booths had been reupholstered, the flickering fluorescent lights replaced with warm Edison bulbs, and a new sign hung in the window. Community table, pay what you can, 4 to 6 p.m. daily. Ethan stood behind the counter, watching the evening crowd with quiet satisfaction. His mother sat in what had become her regular spot, a soft blanket draped over her legs as she chatted with Betty. The experimental treatment had been brutal, but her doctors were cautiously optimistic. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her laugh, though still weak, rang out more frequently each day. Order up! Called a familiar voice from the kitchen. Charlie, no one called him Michael anymore, not even his father, had insisted on earning his keep at the diner. He'd started as a dishwasher, but his military discipline and attention to detail had quickly earned him a spot on the line. Now he wore a crisp white apron, his formerly matted hair neatly trimmed, his eyes clear and focused. The transformation wasn't just physical. During his breaks, Charlie would often sit with other veterans who'd started frequenting the diner, sharing stories and resources. Some nights, the back room hosted informal support group meetings. Other nights, it served as a makeshift classroom where local teachers volunteered to help kids with homework while their parents worked late shifts. William Foster had kept his promise about turning the diner into something more. He'd established a foundation that provided job training and housing assistance, using the diner as its heart. The pay what you can hours had raised eyebrows among local business owners at first, but the community had responded with overwhelming generosity. For every person who couldn't afford to pay, there seemed to be 2 or 3 who would quietly leave extra. Hey boss, Charlie called out, breaking Ethan from his reverie. Dad's here. Ethan looked up to see William Foster entering the diner. He still came in regularly, but now he wore his tailored suits without pretense. The silver hair was neatly combed, the beard trimmed short, but his eyes held the same warmth that had always been there, hidden beneath his former disguise. Evening, everyone, Foster said, making his way to the counter. He stopped to greet Martha Matthews, asking about her latest test results and sharing a joke that made her laugh. The sound of their shared laughter brought a smile to Ethan's face. It was still amazing how much could change in 3 months. "Got a minute?" Foster asked Ethan, gesturing toward the office. "There's something we need to discuss." Inside the office, Foster pulled out a folder. "The Foundation's board met today," he said, opening it to reveal several documents. "We've unanimously approved the expansion plan." Ethan's eyes widened as he looked at the blueprints. The vacant building next door would be converted into a community center, connected to the diner by a glass-enclosed walkway. There would be classrooms, a job training center, and even a small medical clinic. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. He'd learned that when William Foster committed to something, he committed fully. "More sure than I've been about anything in years," Foster replied. "But we'll need help running it. Charlie's agreed to oversee the veterans programs, and Betty." He smiled. "Well, she says she's too old to learn new tricks, but she's already planning cooking classes for the job training program." He pulled out another document. "And we need an executive director. Someone who understands both the business side and the human side. Someone who sees people for who they are, not what they lack." Ethan stared at the job offer, his heart pounding. The salary was generous, but it was the job description that caught his eye. To create a place where second chances are served daily, where dignity is always on the menu, and where community is the special that never runs out. "I don't know what to say," Ethan began, but Foster cut him off with a warm laugh. "That seems to be becoming a habit with you," he said. "But you don't need to say anything. Just keep doing what you've been doing, seeing the best in people, even when they can't see it in themselves." A knock at the office door interrupted them. Charlie poked his head in, his face split by a wide grin. "Sorry to interrupt, but you both need to see this." They followed him out to the dining room, where a small crowd had gathered around Martha Matthews' table. She was standing, actually standing, for the first time in months, supported by Betty on one side and her nurse on the other. "The doctor said I could try," she explained, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Said the treatment's working better than they'd hoped." The entire diner erupted in applause. Regular customers, homeless veterans, students doing homework, staff members, all celebrating together. Ethan felt his own eyes welling up as he watched his mother take one shaky step, then another. "You see that?" Foster said softly, standing beside him. "That's what happens when people choose love over fear, community over isolation." He put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "When I lost my wife and children, I thought I'd never have a family again. Then I lost Michael to his demons, and I lost myself to grief and guilt. But you showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about who you choose to serve, who you choose to love, who you choose to forgive." Charlie joined them, wrapping an arm around his father's shoulders. The gesture was still new enough to make Foster's breath catch, but natural enough to make him smile. "So," Charlie said, "I hear we're expanding. Better make sure the new place has plenty of windows. Some of us like to people watch while we drink our coffee." Ethan laughed, remembering how this had all started, with a lost wallet, a cup of coffee, and the simple choice to see people as they could be, not just as they were. "Windows it will have," Foster agreed. "And an extra long counter. I have a feeling we're going to need this space." As if to prove his point, the bell above the door chimed again. A young woman entered, clutching a baby to her chest, her eyes darting nervously around the diner. Before Ethan could move, Betty was already there, guiding her to a booth, calling out to Charlie for a fresh pot of coffee. "Welcome to Joe's," Ethan heard Betty say. "First cup's on the house, and so is the story sharing, if you're interested." Outside, the sun was setting on another day at Joe's Corner Diner, where a simple act of kindness had sparked a revolution of the heart, one cup of coffee at a time. And inside, Ethan Matthews stood at the center of it all, knowing that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, like returning a wallet, sharing a meal, or simply seeing the humanity in every face that walks through the door.